All right, let's look at one last example of a psychological injury, and we're going to look at guilt. I consider guilt to be the poison in our system. And you'll see why, because guilt poisons not just our minds in a way, but our relationships as well. We tend to feel a lot of guilt, much more than we realize. One study found that in short bursts of mild guilt, we can experience up to 2.5 hours a day of mild guilt, up to 5 hours a week of moderate guilt, and up to 3.5 hours a month of severe guilt. Well, people say, really, that much? How come? And I say, well, think about it. You're sitting at work, and you're like, it's my mother's birthday. I forgot to call. I really have to remember to call. 10 minutes past. Oh, I really have to remember to call my mother. Let me do it right after this meeting. Oh, I have to go into another meeting. I have to remember. It's like a snooze alarm, right? That keeps reminding you of what you need to do. And in that sense, guilt is like a lot of psychological constructs. Too little of it, not so good. A moderate amount, good. Too much of it, not so good. Because guilt has an important function. It preserves our relationships. It lets us know when we've done or are about to do something that can harm another person. And it allows us to not do the thing we were thinking of doing, or to try and correct it, atone for it, take responsibility, and apologize. So it's like a superhero. It swoops in and says, no, that relationship is important, do something about it. But when the guilt is excessive, when it's unrelenting, when it's unresolved, it's like a snooze alarm that doesn't stop going off even when you're awake. It's just signaling in your brain over and over and over again. It is extraordinarily distracting. And guilt can be extremely, extremely distracting. It is a huge mental and emotional drain. It's actually an emotional burden. But the burden, turns out, is not just emotional. They did a study in which they divided people into two groups. They said to one group, we'd like you to recall a time where you did something really ethical. And they said to the other group, we would like you to recall a time where you did something really unethical. And they had them write about it. So they made one group of people feel guilty. And then they said to them, people's weight tends to fluctuate. We'd like you to estimate how much your current weight is relative to normal. And the people who were made to feel guilty estimated themselves to weigh much more than the guilt who wasn't made to feel guilty. In other words, the actual burden of guilt literally made them feel weighed down. And even further, they then said to them, we would like you to estimate how much effort it takes to do certain pro-social activities, like helping a disabled person up the stairs with their groceries or their laundry. And the people who were made to feel guilty estimated that it would take much more effort to do that pro-social task than the people who didn't feel guilty, because they were burdened. They felt weighed down, literally. It's another way in which it really impacted how they felt physically. And so what happens to us when we're guilty is that we tend to try and manage the guilt in both conscious and unconscious ways. In one study, they gave college students, this is how they do guilt in some of the college studies. They'll put people in front of a computer and they'll tell them, you're playing a game with a partner against two other people. Obviously, as you've now figured out, the partner's fake, the two other people don't exist, but they tell them that, and then they tell them at the end, you did well in that game, but the way you played, only you get the prize, not your partner. And the prize was going to be a few lottery tickets. So we're talking about a cheap prize, which probably is worth nothing. So they say that. And then they have them wait in another room where, coincidentally, oh, yeah, that's your partner who didn't get the tickets. So they make them feel guilty, and they make them look at the person who they deprived of the lottery tickets, who obviously is a research assistant who's sitting there scowling. And then they say to them, now you can choose your reward for participating in the study. Now, people who are not made to feel guilty chose CDs and DVDs and fun things. And what did the people who were made to feel guilty choose? Pens and notebooks and school supplies, not fun things. Because when we feel guilty, we don't feel entitled to enjoy life. And that's a very small example of it. But we don't. When you feel really guilty about something, when you did miss your mother's birthday, or when you did something that really hurt your friend's feelings, and people say, oh, let's go out and have fun. You're like, I don't think I feel like having fun. And we really don't feel that way. But what happens is, the unconscious guilt management, it's not just about that it prevents us from enjoying life, it actually makes us adopt self-punishment in all kinds of unconscious ways. Think of the experiment with the lottery tickets. They did a version of it in which they said to the people who had the horrible sin of depriving an unknown person of lottery tickets, and they said to them, they're going to be in the waiting room, and we just wanted to see if you'd be willing to do something to express your remorse. And they said, sure, what? And they said, well, there's a little contraption there where you put your hand and there's a switch, and if you flick the switch, it'll give you an uncomfortable electrical shock. Would you be willing to do that? And they said, well, let me see. And they go out there and put their hand in the thing, and there's a switch, and the research assistant is sitting there scowling at being deprived of their lottery tickets, and way more people than not flip the switch. They're willing to give themselves an uncomfortable electrical shock for depriving somebody they don't know of lottery tickets that probably aren't worth anything in the first place. Now, I want to be very clear. There was no electrical shock, because, the point of it is not to electrocute the volunteers. The point of it is to see if they would flip the switch. So once they flipped the switch, we didn't need them to have the zap. So there is a humane-ish aspect to these kinds of studies. So just wanted to be very, very clear about that. So, there's, and you know what they call this? They call this tendency to self-punish. They recently gave it a name, and they called it the Dobby effect. And does anyone know why? Harry Potter. There's an elf in the Harry Potter movies who's a self-punishing elf. He smacks his head against the wall because Dobby's a bad elf. That's what they called the phenomena. And then the last thing is that when we feel guilty, instead of repairing the relationship, we tend to avoid. Because what happens is, we'll usually apologize. Oh, I'm sorry I didn't make your birthday party, to our good friend whose party we missed. And they'll say, well, okay, I understand, you had a bad day at work, whatever. But then the tension remains. And over time that tension is still there, and we feel uncomfortable, and every time we see the friend, it reminds us that we really did something we're not very proud of, so we start not seeing the friend as much, and not going to those social gatherings where the friend is there. And it happens in families, and then the families can kind of coalesce on the two sides of the person who did the thing and the person who didn't do the thing, and over time we actually start to avoid the person who's making us feeling guilty, not consciously, but unconsciously. We'll find excuses, and that relationship gets frayed and frayed and frayed. And that's why I was saying earlier that guilt can really poison our relationships. Now, let's look at a solution for guilt. It is astonishing, but the vast majority of the time, what actually does happen is our apology sucked. Because where we are with apologies is roughly where we were at age 5. At age 5, we were told, you must say sorry. Fine, I'm sorry, you're forgiven, and on we go. And that's kind of where we are. We'll say sorry, maybe with a little bit less attitude, but that's the level of sophistication our apologies have. And unfortunately, psychologists aren't much better. Up until very recently, when they studied apologies and forgiveness, the question was an apology rendered? Check. Or apology not rendered? Check. What kind of apology? Was it effective? What might have made it effective? No one cared. But recently they did start looking at that. And it turns out that there are 6 ingredients an effective apology should have. And just to remind you, an apology has one goal in mind, not the 5-year-old goal of just saying it. The goal of an apology is to garner authentic forgiveness from the other person. It's the only goal. And so how do you get the authentic forgiveness? Well, in my book I go through all the 6 ingredients and give case studies about each one and the missing ingredients, but I want to mention one of the ingredients. It's the one I consider the most important, primarily because it's the one we tend to omit most often, and it's also the one that has the most active ingredient in terms of eliciting the authentic forgiveness, and that is an empathy statement. If we want the other person to really forgive us, we have to be able to convey that we get what happened to them, not from our point of view, from their point of view. So yes, you can lavish, which is what we tend to do, the explanation of how I had a terrible day at work, you see, and my boss did this, you see, and so when I got home, I just felt so not up to it. Surely you understand why I didn't show up to your party, even though you're my best friend. But that doesn't say to the other person that we get what we did to them. What would say that we get what we did to them is that if we said to them, look, I'm really sorry I didn't come. And you're my best friend. I'm sure you were standing there all night thinking, where am I? Why am I not showing? And I know how much effort you put into this party and how important it was for you. And I'm sure other people must have come up to you and say, hey, where am I? And you didn't even know what to say, which is probably embarrassing as well as annoying. And so I probably ruined your party for you. I wouldn't be surprised if I really ruined the party for you after all the effort you put into it, and I am so, so sorry that I did that. I realize that's what must have happened. I feel terrible. Now, it's difficult to own that. It's difficult to be that responsible and to really own it. But if the relationship is important, if we really want to garner that authentic forgiveness, yes, we actually have to be adults and convey to the other person, I'm aware of the implications. And when we hear that on the receiving end, it is so much easier for us to go, you know what, I'm so glad you get it, and to forgive. And once they forgive, our guilt will dissolve. But that's what it takes. That's the active ingredient, and the ingredient that we forget all the time.